All right. Thank you all for attending our webinar today. My name is Glenn Irvine. I look after cloud and emerging technologies at Dialog Information Technology within the Dialog Group. And we're running a series of basically thought leadership webinars coming from various elements of the Dialog Group. I'll quickly just kick in our presentation so we can just share that. So effectively what we're looking at with today's webinar and over the next few months are presentations from some of our more senior executive in the group around various topics that we think would be of interest in the industry. So today we've actually got Greg Barnett from the Access HQ company, which is part of the Dialog Group, who's going to be talking about digital accessibility. But before we quickly dive into the presentation, we'll just explain who we are very quickly. So again, I head up Cloud and Emerging Technologies and will be your host today. Greg will be speaking, and Greg is the General Manager for Customer Experience and at the Insights practice at Access HQ. And I'm sure many of the attendees today will actually know of Access HQ and Greg. So, because I know there's a number of our clients among you. A little bit of housekeeping. There is the capability for you to do chat and apply chat questions throughout the presentation. If something occurs to you, feel free to throw that question into the chat messages, and we'll be able to tackle those when we hit the Q&A section at the end. I'll quickly go through and give you a bit of a précis about what Dialog is, and very quickly, just so we can get into the meat of Greg's presentation. So Dialog Information Technology, for those who are not familiar with it, is one of the largest privately owned IT services company in Australia, in the sense of being privately owned. Just about everything larger than us is a public company. We were established over 40 years ago with over 1,000 consultants across Australia, largely providing that strategic consulting and application development right across the life cycle of applications, and also managed application services. A number of our subsidiary companies, of which Access HQ is one, listed on the right side of the screen there. One, of course, is ICE Media, which looks after our web development, Catapult BI, which is our business intelligence capability, and then there's Access HQ, who are presenting today, which largely look at assurance and testing of IT solutions. We have clients across all levels of government and industries, and some very strong vendor partners. So right across the cloud providers, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, etc., into some of the more traditional vendors like IBM, SAP, etc. But there's a range of strong relationships that we do have across our vendor partners. And also, as you can see from the brag screen there, a number of great client partnerships across government and the corporate sector across Australia, and many of those spanning over the last several decades. There's some quick contact details, and I know Greg got some contact details for Access HQ. If you want to follow up after this presentation today, at the end of it, you'll have his contact details there as well. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Greg and get him to start his presentation largely around digital accessibility. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to do a little screen share switch, and we cross our fingers that the technology behaves. All being well, everyone can now see title of our PowerPoint presentation here, Driving Accessibility Excellence on Your Projects. So again, thanks for joining us this afternoon. It's really great to see some familiar, I was going to say familiar faces, but familiar names in our participant list. Fantastic. Would have rather we were in a more personable face-to-face environment for some of these things, but this is the brave new world we're working in, of course, today. So, as Glenn mentioned, I'm going to be addressing some digital accessibility related things today, aimed very heavily at sort of the business stakeholder side of things, but I'm mindful of we've got a very mix of different people on the call, but you will see that focus on driving this from a business standpoint on any given project, for example. Most of you, I believe, will be familiar with Access. For those on the call who perhaps aren't, basically we do two things at Access HQ. We do software testing really well, but we also help our clients reimagine their approach to quality in what we sort of call this changing digital age, where we believe a lot of the techniques that are applied to quality assurance in technology need to be applied different to how they were in the past. What we're talking about today in the realms of accessibility, primarily sits in that software testing space, because a large part of it is applying testing techniques. But there's certainly no doubt about the fact that it does expand into this reimagine, particularly where clients, organisations haven't necessarily embraced or looked at things they need to do from an accessibility and inclusivity standpoint. So we kind of cover both things there today. Pretty straightforward agenda. As I mentioned, we're going to focus a little bit on the business case for accessibility. We'll just kind of recap on types of disabilities. Who are we talking about? What does that mean? We will look at some things you potentially can do differently on your projects, and possibly what most of the folks on the call are going to be interested in is some of the real common accessibility pitfalls we see time and time again on the projects we're working on. And then, of course, we'll have Q&A. We'll go for 20-25 minutes, but of course, we're more than happy to stick around for as long as people have questions for discussion. So on that, let's get stuck into it. I will bring up some example work we've done with clients potentially throughout the presentations to help illustrate some things. These are some key clients we've worked with in the past, and I'll particularly be talking about the airlines and some of the government departments and so forth. But we do accessibility across all industries in many ways. And, that's quite important also to address different considerations in accessibility in government versus in the commercial space. So we'll cover a bit of that. But, first and foremost, when we talk about digital accessibility, inclusivity, who are we talking about? And roughly speaking, we talk about these four considerations. Being mindful that it's entirely possible for multiple considerations to be at play with an individual. Most people, when they think about digital accessibility, they tend to gravitate towards the vision impairment space. Someone who's blind, what do they have to do to use a website? And certainly that's certainly one of the key considerations. But vision impairment does come in many guises, ranging from people that are completely blind, partially blind, even poor eyesight. If you think about your parents, grandparents, elderly people, heck, I wear glasses. Eyesight is a consideration, and colour blindness is an important consideration. I can't see the exact numbers on here, but by way of example, roughly 1 in 7 males have some form of colour blindness. And that's a consideration under vision impairment. What this means is that there's techniques these people with these impairments have to use when they're using a website, and we'll explore that a little bit more. Hearing impairment is another part of it as well. Full hearing impairment, partial hearing impairment. Can be quite simple from a standpoint of, captions for audios on videos, those sort of things, but also can be quite important from consideration of how someone with a hearing impairment might get in touch with your organisation, given they might not want to use a phone and so forth. Physical impairment, whether that's the severity of missing limbs, could even be reduced motor control, could even be reduced dexterity. Primarily, this is kind of someone who probably can't use a mouse. They have to rely on their keyboard or some other pointing device, or even potentially voice control to control their computer. And then the last one here is this area of cognitive impairments. Tends to be a little bit less talked about because it's less tangible and it's not often as easy to understand, but it's this concept of neurodiversity, people with learning difficulties, lower reading levels, people that are slower to process information, those kind of considerations which are very important. And, of course, an individual can have more than one of these impairments. These impairments can be permanent. These impairments can be temporary. I like to use the example of you go off on a skiing holiday in winter, heaven forbid, fall off your snowboard, break your arm, break your right arm, and you're right-handed. Well, all of a sudden, you're returning back to the office with a temporary physical impairment, which means you maybe can't use a mouse to do your job, and then you're falling back on, say, using your keyboard. So, keep in mind, this doesn't necessarily apply only to people who officially associate with having a disability. The business case, really 3 things we talk about with organisations in what drives the need for accessibility. There is a legal compliance consideration, and this gets talked about quite a lot. There's quite a lot of precedents now in the Australian marketplace. Many people will be familiar with the legal action brought against SOCOG in the Sydney Olympics in 2000. The case was brought against Coles with online shopping. There's been a number of cases that exist and are now set precedents within Australia. There's a very interesting legal compliance thing I'll talk a little bit later on affecting the airlines within Australia. But over and above legal compliance, there's a social responsibility that we have to ensure that all services are accessible to all people. So without a doubt, that's a very strong play, and that tends to be the primary driver, of course, for any of the folks in the government side of things on the webinar. The last one we mentioned here, market opportunity, we bring that up because it's often forgotten. It can be a real challenge for folks who are working in the commercial space, who are maybe embarking on trying to drive accessibility within their organisation. Driving accessibility does have a cost, and that can be challenging when faced with conflicting costs, in the boardroom against the CFO. How can I drive a business case to have money spent on this? And what we like to do is demonstrate, but it is actually quite easy to demonstrate a market opportunity business case if you're driving accessibility within your organisation, and we'll get to that shortly. From a standpoint of that market, some of the stats, now these are readily available for anyone, Bureau of Statistics, number of organisations publish these stats, but it's often come as a surprise to people that around 17%, about 4.4 million people within Australia actually associate with having a disability. It's a very large group of people. 36% of households in Australia include a person with a disability. And this is a really interesting angle because that then just has wider impact over and above the people with a disability, but also the people they associate with. From a working standpoint, 2.1 million people with a disability of a working age, of which about half of those are actually participating in the workforce. And this is very important for accessibility considerations in all these internal systems we use. Accessibility doesn't just apply to the websites that our customers are using. Our internal systems within organisations have to be accessible to apply equal opportunity for our staff. And then looking at different disabilities, about 350,000 people who are blind or associated with low vision. So the numbers aren't small here, and this is where the market opportunity angle is a really interesting space for accessibility. What we do to help illustrate that and to help explain how people on the call can potentially use that within your own organisations is show a very, very simple way to calculate that. We use an airline example because most people understand that, and it's pretty straightforward. Mindful of the fact that, of course, currently the airline world is a very different place to what it was historically, but we're all, of course, hopeful in time that will come back. But I'm saying, don't get too hung up on the example here. Just have a look at this as a potential technique to how you might be able to use a similar calculation in your organisation. And the concept is, well, let's just have a look at the 350-odd thousand people with low vision, just by way of example, being mindful there's still a whole lot more people that come into play. And hey, let's for argument's sake say 15% of those take a return flight once a year, and average price of that return flight is $400, give or take. Again, you'll want to apply your own numbers, be as conservative as you think makes sense. But purely in this example, what we recognise there is that on its own represents in excess of $20 million revenue per annum for a particular organisation who chooses to embrace accessibility, put the effort in on their website, whatever it happens to be. We know from all the work in the space, but in the case of an airline and the complexity of that website and what it would take, the cost to solve all of this is less than 2% of that revenue. And to sort of translate that into something else, an airline needs to sell about 10,000 seats in order to recoup the cost of that. And that's 10,000 seats based on the quite low profit margins that airlines run at, not to turn this into an airline profit margin discussion. To put that into perspective, last year, Qantas sold over 55 million seats, 153,000 seats per day. So in a very thin slice of the day, an airline, by way of example here, can recoup the cost at a net profit level to cover that. Again, the airline example here is only an example, but it's hopefully a way to demonstrate that, you know, for those on the webinar, plug in your own numbers and you should be able to very easily demonstrate a market opportunity for your companies potentially. Now, probably many people on the webinar will be familiar with this guy, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, in this case on the screen 2.1. There was a 2.0, 2.2 is in the works. A lot of people will know it as WCAG, WCAG, YCAG, you know, goes by a few terms. Fundamentally, these are the guidelines that drive what we need to do in the digital space. And broadly speaking, if we follow these guidelines, our websites will be accessible. But there's a little bit of some things misunderstood with these guidelines around what the rules are, and I talk specifically here more around what the rules are in Australia, because there are some misconceptions in that, the rules are to comply to those guidelines. And in fact, the law within Australia isn't to comply to those guidelines. The law here falls under what's called the Disability Discrimination Act. And fundamentally, that's legislation that says an organisation needs to provide equal access by law. Whether or not that's done through the WCAG guidelines or not, by law, we have to provide equal access. So that's where the legal side of all of this sits. If someone brings a case against an organisation, it's being brought against the organisation under breach of the Disability Discrimination Act. It's quite important to note that. Now, within Australia, our government, broadly speaking, mandates that all government websites are compliant to WCAG. Typically at the moment it's WCAG 2.0, the previous version of the guidelines, and what's called level AA within those guidelines. It's one of the levels. We are starting to see some government looking to adopt 2.1 of the guidelines, but government has sort of basically set out a mandate. We just want government to follow these guidelines. So it can be quite easy in that regards for anyone working in the government space, because you just have to follow those guidelines as part of that direction. With that said, there is these guidelines right now. The official version is WCAG 2.1. They're not a legally binding set of guidelines, so they're not part of the Disability Discrimination Action per se, but they are the best foundation for us to drive accessibility in our digital systems, for want of a better word. And certainly, you know, I know there's some people on the call who are on the more tech side of things, devs and whatnot, who tend to be more familiar with these guidelines and some of the techniques and things you need to use. But hopefully that clears up, you know, some possible misnomers around the rules in this space. On the legal compliance thing, it's quite interesting. I brought up the airlines earlier. The airlines within Australia are in a very interesting space, because actually the United States Department of Transportation has brought out some very specific laws that mandate accessibility for foreign carriers flying into the USA. So in the case of Virgin, Jetstar and Qantas, who do fly into the USA, or certainly did, they actually have to comply to some very specific US laws in order to maintain the rights to fly into the USA. So it's been quite an interesting space in the airline world. Anyway, moving along, given the sort of confusion around these rules and trying to drive great accessibility, we developed what we call our accessibility maturity model. And it recognizes a few things. It was a catalyst out of the fact that we looked at a random range of government websites, about 150 in all, selected from federal, state and local. And what we discovered in that investigation of that sample, 54% of those hadn't even begun the journey towards digital accessibility at all. And we don't talk about this from a standpoint of saying, oh, they're bad, they're not doing the right thing. We talk about this from a standpoint of, you know, digital accessibility isn't easy. It is a journey, and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes some investment and so forth. It's not just something you can magically achieve overnight. But the principle of maturity model here is where most organizations are striving for this concept of WCAG 2.0 level AA compliance, to use a bit of jargon. In our view, in our model here, for us, that's level 2. And for us, that's only part way along the journey. We believe very strongly in organizations going above and beyond just tick boxing against the guidelines to ensure much, much better accessibility. Sometimes that means addressing what's called some of the AAA criteria, some of the more complex criteria within those guidelines. But really for us, it's about this level 4 here, where it's really about bringing usability and accessibility together. So we don't just tick box against guidelines, we factor in real world usage of people with disabilities to really genuinely make sure our websites, apps, what have you, are in fact easy to use for those people. Just as we give the same attention for all users in a general user experience context. I'm often asked at this point, have many customers reached number 4 in this particular context? Not a lot. There's still quite a lot of work to do in the space, but certainly within the work we do in New South Wales, Transport for New South Wales are one really great example of an organisation who managed to get there, where they focus very heavily on that. The airlines have started to get closer to that. They're not quite there yet, but they're headed in the right direction. So we really sort of, when we work with an organisation to help them drive accessibility, we really focus on this. Yes, you want to tick box against the guidelines, but your real goal is around bringing usability and accessibility together. Hope that makes sense to folks on the webinar. What's it like? There'll be many people on the webinar who are very much familiar with this, but for those who are less familiar, what is it like using a website with a disability? And probably the sort of most illustrative way of that is, how does a blind person use a website? And, I've had very interesting discussions with people over the years where people have even said to me, well, blind people don't use websites. You can't see the screen. Well, of course they do. And for those who aren't familiar with it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play play a video, but technically it's only audio because I'm trying to mimic the experience of a blind person who, in this case, can't see the screen, just so people can get a bit of a feel for what this thing is. Now, what you're going to hear here is a piece of software called a screen reader speaking the contents of a particular web page. I'm not going to give any more of that away. I'm just going to advance to that, and now I'm going to play it, so hopefully everyone can hear that audio.
Link discover more. Saks buys Diet Ginger Beer Bottle. List with 2 items. Link 750 ml. Link $2.15. Link $2.87/1L. Link graphic locally made. Link graphic Saks buys Diet Ginger Beer. Button choose a list to save Saks buys Diet Ginger Beer. Button add to cart. Link 4x 375 ml. Link $4.30.
I'll leave it at that. What hopefully people have recognized in the call is, well, one of the challenges with a screen reader is you do have to deal with this sort of, slightly horrid computerized voice speaking at a certain speed. Real vision impaired users using a screen reader will often have it speaking much faster, incidentally. They get tuned in to listen to it. But, hopefully you recognize, it's kind of hard to understand what's going on there, and you have to really tune in. If you want to see what that screen reader was actually speaking, this was the page that I was using that screen reader on. Some of you might recognize this as a screen grab simply from the Woolworths online shopping website. And that's what we're dealing here. So, you might have heard things, for example, Saks buys ginger beer. Often words are pronounced in funny ways. Things like 1L and 750 mils and prices are pronounced in complicated ways. You may have picked up, hopefully, that it announced when something was a button or not. But what you hopefully realize there is that using a screen reader on a website isn't an easy thing in the world. And we need to do everything we can to make that a easy experience for people who have to use that tool as their way of doing it. Now, we don't all have access to screen readers easily, although there are a number of free screen readers everyone can access. So, anyone can kind of grab a screen reader and have a shot at that. One of the things we recommend to anyone, because it's just so easy to do that it's almost a crime not to do it. If you want to get a feel for the accessibility of your own website or something you're working on or a competitor's website, whatever it is, easiest thing you can do, put your mouse in the drawer and use your keyboard to navigate the website. That means using the tab key to get around. That means using enter to activate links, using arrows and space to use forms and those sort of things. It's a great way of very, very quickly and easily testing, say, a website of your own. You don't really need any extra training. You don't need to buy or download any extra software, and you can very easily get a feel for whether or not you are accessible. If it works great, then you've got a pretty good handle on the fact that you're headed in the right direction. For those that do this on a website that's not accessible, you'll learn very, very quickly in using a keyboard how difficult it can be when the website's not accessible. And we'll talk more about that shortly. But it's a really, really good way to just very quickly get a feel for whether things are right on your end. Which, as a segue, you know, if you're a business sponsor on a project, if you're a product owner, you know, driving a new website, a new app, or whatever, what are some things you can really do to help drive accessibility within your system? Because what typically happens when a system gets requested from an IT team or a vendor or what have you, is we simply make a statement that says, hey, please ensure this website is compliant to WCAG guidelines, or something to that effect. Now, that's very important because that helps at a contractual level to ensure what needs to be done. But we really strongly recommend that you spell this out a bit more for whatever dev team or ICT team is potentially building what you're trying to get built. And it would just say, you know, this is not everything, but go a little bit further to say, great, it has to be WCAG compliant, but, you know, pay attention to the colors we use. Make sure this thing will actually use with a keyboard. So the developers themselves will jump on a keyboard and use it when they're actually cutting code, and they'll get it right from the beginning. And ideally, even encourage the dev teams to ensure the system is working with screen readers and get them using those tools within the development lifecycle as they cut code. Doing this really helps you avoid getting to the pointy end of a project to discover, oh my God, we've got a whole lot of accessibility things we need to address that we didn't cover earlier. Get these things addressed as early as you can. And by giving this sort of spelling out this extra information to your dev teams, it can really, really go a long way. But all that said, you know, we see dozens, hundreds of websites every year that we look at from accessibility context, different pages, different usages. What I want to take you through now is the 5 most common things we see every single time we test a website. And what's interesting about these 5 things is they actually haven't changed all that much over the past few years. There's still hurdles for devs teams day in and day out today. So the more the people on the call can learn from these pitfalls and not make these mistakes, for us, that's a real win. And we can address some of the more complicated or the more usability related issues. Believe it or not, the number one thing we still see made today is poor use of color. This is just a little mock-up we've done to demonstrate that. Pale text on pale backgrounds, dark text on dark brackets. Here I've got grey text on a grey background. Color combinations that are very difficult to read. Even for someone with perfect eyesight, these color combinations are difficult to read. Never mind someone with vision impairment. Whereas the WCAG guidelines have some very clear specifications around what color combinations should be used. Makes perfect sense, just follow those. But we still see this time and time again. You've no doubt all experienced, you know, picking up a product in the supermarket to try and read something on the label, only to discover that the product people have used, you know, yellow text on a white packaging and you can't read it. The same thing applies to the digital space. And do everything you can to avoid this. Something not working with keyboard, believe it or not, is very, very common. A little bit hard to demonstrate that with screenshots. I'm doing as best I can. Still, one of the most common things we see day in and day out is when you use the tab key to move around a website and tab between links and buttons and whatnot, is that the website is actually missing what's called focus visibility. Focus visibility is on the bottom screenshot here, that little blue line, or depending on what system you're using, it might be a different color, that little line that goes around whatever you've tapped onto. And as you go tab, 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 tab through the screen, that little line moves about so you know where you are. We still see time and time again websites that don't have any focus visibility, and you're pressing the tab key without having any concept of what you're actually tabbed onto. Typically means hitting enter and hoping at random that you've maybe opened something you want to open. Very easy to solve. The irony of this particular one is actually, in order to break focus visibility, developers actually have to introduce code. If no code is introduced to do that, by default, focus visibility is on. So it's very interesting from that standpoint. There's no doubt that websites and apps are getting more and more complex with widgets. that do various things. On the left here, little opening and closing accordions. In the middle, tabs that move between content. On the right-hand side, dialog windows, modal windows, pop-up boxes, light boxes, whatever you want to call them. All of these widgets, but are aimed at making better experiences on websites. They can be great from that standpoint, but they do have to be implemented in very specific ways to make them accessible. Various coding techniques that you need to do to make those work. And we still see time and time again when we embark on testing the site that these widgets just haven't been correctly implemented. They can be. There are coding techniques that allow that to be done, but it does need to actually be done. Forms are a really interesting space, and obviously that brings in an amount of complexity. But one of the things that's very, very common on websites today is to use what we probably call custom form elements. Instead of using a stock standard HTML select box, radio button, checkbox, what have you, I will use a custom form element on my form. Usually because they look nicer, and there's no doubt about that. If you look at these screenshots or any websites, quite often these custom form elements do look a lot nicer and can create a better experience for our customers. Again, if you are going to use custom form elements, there are very specific things you need to do to code those to make them accessible. The screenshots on here are just sort of random ones I grabbed. I haven't necessarily tested those, although one of them here, I think we might have some folks from Health Direct on the webinar. If anyone might be familiar with the Health Direct symptom checker, it's a very, very valuable tool for anyone who has sick kids or whatnot. That uses a lot of custom form elements, but the Health Direct folks have done a really phenomenal job at making sure all of those are accessible. Custom form elements aren't usually accessible out of the box. You do need to do the right things to code them to make them accessible. And the last of the 5 here, we're getting on for time, is still form related, but we hone in on it specifically. It's these type ahead combo boxes, whatever you call it. This is a screenshot from Google. We've all seen these where you start typing and it brings up some suggestions. Very, very common for when we want to enter an address on some sort of a form. These are phenomenally troublesome with screen reader tools because of the ability for the screen reader tool to announce the suggestions, for the ability of the screen reader user to be able to navigate to the suggestions. It can be done. They can be made accessible. There are a number of techniques out there that allow for that, but they are notoriously hard to get right if you don't apply those techniques. So for anyone who's looking to design this sort of functionality into a website, we strongly suggest you have a look at some of these techniques right from the get-go to make sure you get this right, or potentially even question whether or not this is the right widget to use on whatever design you're trying to achieve. That's the 5th of the most common things we see. Of which, just by recap, and what you see on this screen, we have as a little document we're going to distribute to everyone who has who registered for the session today, by way of your key takeaways. But just to recap, 3 reasons why. This is all about legal compliance, it's about corporate social responsibility, and it's about possibly leveraging a great market opportunity that your competitors aren't. When it comes to driving something with a vendor or an IT team or what have you, 4 things to insist on: WCAG compliance, but make it work on a keyboard, get the colors right, make it work with screen readers, and by all means, watch out, particularly for those 5 common pitfalls. There are more, but certainly watch out for those common pitfalls. At which point, that brings us broadly to the end of the main content of the webinar. Our goal now is to open up for Q&A. Anyone on the call or rather on the webinar who would like to raise questions, more than happy to certainly try and answer anything we can on the webinar. If there are any questions we can't answer, we will get the answer for you.
Okay, so basically if you can use the Q&A or the chat capability within Zoom to put forward your question if you're interested. We have got one from Rob, and I'll throw that to you, Greg, at this stage. Rob's asked, with the current need for quick up-to-date information, we see that Auslan is now more visible, but what about Easy Read? Do you have any thoughts on how government can quickly achieve this to keep pace with announcements, as 1 or 2 days later may have seen the information already change?
Good question. It's not the Easy Read stuff isn't something I'm completely up with, and it's possibly something we need to have a look at. If I understand this correctly, some of these tools that you can implement on your website that are sort of built into your website to allow them to read the website itself without necessarily a website having their own reliance on someone using a screen reader or what have you. They can work very, very well, and they're certainly a great thing to have on sites. It potentially eases the path to being accessible. I suppose the thing we would throw at is one of the real goals around accessibility, and it's brought up in the WCAG guidelines, is they talk about this concept of something being robust, and what that means is that ensuring something will work with kind of any device out there or any new devices that come into play. And from that standpoint, we do still strongly say, great, you can use those tools, but still focus on your actual coding semantics, getting it to work in the ways it should be, so that it will in fact work with any assistive technologies, the lingo in the industry, and hence make it robust for new things that come into play. It's probably my best response to that. That said, I'm now intrigued to just go and dig a little bit deeper into some of that. If I do learn any more there, I'll be happy to pass on some info for you.
Okay, I hope that addressed it. Rob, Russ has asked, when planning for a new website, at what point should accessibility be considered? During wireframes or more in the design phase or build phase, or all of the above?
Very easy one, all of the above. Being mindful that there's different things you need to do at different stages. Wireframes is probably the starting point, because what you can do once you start to hit the wireframe stage is you start to got some views on, well, what are the widgets we're looking at using on a particular part of the website. You know, are we going to use some of those type of head combo boxes, or are we using other techniques, tabs, what have you? And really, it's at that point you need to go, okay, great, we've decided we're going to be using this particular widget in this context because we like that from the design the experience going to create. So let's now be mindful that we are going to have to take on considerations for that when we start cutting code. And that can be simply as a matter of going, okay, great, we've decided to use a type of head combo box. Let's give the devs a heads up now that they're going to have to do it in this way, as opposed to doing it afterwards. As you then, of course, move into development, you've actually got real code and real widgets. You, of course, start to test in real life to see if they work. But yeah, definitely get started on accessibility considerations very early in the piece. Sometimes some of those color considerations, you need to be addressing way early when you're, potentially have someone working on branding and color considerations. It wouldn't be the first time we've seen an organisation spend a whole lot of effort on branding and on a colour palette and so forth, only to get 6 months down the track and discover that colour palette is incredibly challenging from an accessibility standpoint. Earlier the better.
All right.
Hope that covers that for you, Russ.
Do we have any other questions here at the moment? I appreciate you've got to type your questions, so I'll just give it a bit of time. We might just get Greg to throw up your contact details on the next slide quickly while we're waiting for that.
Which, yeah, if you think of questions afterwards, or you feel your question is maybe a bit more complicated than we can address on something like a Zoom webinar, by all means, feel to reach out through contact details here. Find me on LinkedIn, whatever's easiest for you. We're more than happy to help address any questions moving forward.
All right, if there's no more questions, then, hang on, no, we're good, yep. No, we've actually got from Brad, what is the best thing an agency can do to make the partnership with Access HQ successful for delivering sites to clients?
Good question, Brad. I think Russ maybe covered that off. Involve early. And I don't just say that because we want to be involved early in a project because it's good for business, but have some very simple reviews at those wireframing stage. Have some reviews when we're at the more high fidelity mock-up stage, and then we can help point you guys in the right direction for techniques to apply once your devs start cutting code. that sort of thing. Bring us in early from a standpoint, even at conceptualizing how a design might work, particularly if it's say a native app or something, and there needs to be more considerations in how that's going to work for real people. Start early is probably the summation of that.
Okay. All right, we've got one from Tony, which says, how often have you seen accessibility problems escalate to a legal case?
Not a lot. There is the two really well sort of talked about examples in the world are that original SOCOG example, where a gentleman brought legal action against SOCOG for the ability to buy tickets for the Sydney Olympics way back in 2000, for anyone who can remember that. Much more recently is the case that was brought against Coles probably about 3 years ago now, I think, from an online shopping standpoint. They're the two key ones within Australia. I haven't heard of others other than what we've heard from people with disabilities. They will quite often, the other one that might be well known about was the one brought against CommBank over their FPOS terminal, the Albert FPOS terminal, which had some major accessibility considerations. Quite often these things don't necessarily end up all the way to court because, of course, they end up settling outside of court or are solved in other ways. But they're the three key ones locally. There's some really interesting cases in the US, of course, and we probably all know that, but the legal world over there is a whole next level. But I know there was a class action brought against Target USA in excess of $10 million. So will it ever cascade to that level with us in Australia? Probably not. We tend not to play in that same space, but there's no doubt about the legal side is a key thing.
Okay, we've got one here. Any obvious differences in development design considerations for mobile devices versus desktop?
There are a few, without a doubt. Some of them are in the classic realms of usability as opposed to necessarily accessibility, and that's size of things on screen. It is interesting. The WCAG 2.1 guidelines did finally bring in some things around what's called target size. So, size of things on your screen from a tapping standpoint, and dexterity needed to do that. So that's one of the key considerations in the mobile space. One of the other interesting things we often talk about if you're really focusing on mobile, or quite often organisations have a mobile first approach, is environmental considerations. Remembering people on their mobiles aren't sitting at a quiet desk in an office all peaceful and tranquil. You're on a bus, you've got background noise, you're maybe mindful of someone sitting next to you looking at your screen. You've got different lighting, sunlight shining on contrast colours and so forth. So there definitely are some other considerations. Probably most of the time, really good mobile usability will translate very rapidly to good accessibility, and then you still need the underlying coding to make it work with the screen readers. The mobile is an interesting space because all of us who we've either got an iPhone or an Android, something or other, they have screen readers built into them by default. You don't have to buy any special software. It's all there. They do create quite nice experiences, a whole lot of other accessibility features. So in some regards, the mobile devices have the ability to dramatically improve the accessibility of either apps or mobile first websites if we get things right.
All right, we've got another one here. Any known challenges or limitations of accessibility testing to be covered for SaaS platforms like Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, and Power BI?
Yeah, I did a Power BI project, probably last year. Some big challenges. Look, from a testing standpoint, all of these platforms can be tested for accessibility. That's a no-brainer. It's turning on screen readers, using keyboards, etc., etc. The real challenge is whether changes can be actually made in these platforms to actually make them accessible. The things like the Salesforces of the world and whatnot have got a lot better, but it's not unusual for us, for example, to do an accessibility testing project for a client, raise a concern we have with a particular widget, and the response is, oh, well, no, that's Salesforce functionality. We can't change that. We have to raise a ticket back to Salesforce. I'm not picking on Salesforce here. I'm just using that as an example. So it's not so much from a testing standpoint, but can be a real challenge from a getting problems rectified standpoint if something's hardwired into that platform. Power BI seems to be at a whole nother level. Power BI reports. Short of saying bad things about Microsoft and Power BI reports, they do publish a lot of information around them being accessible, but they are some of the most inaccessible things that we've come across, and are hugely challenging from that standpoint in their current guise. So sometimes with these platforms, it can be necessary to actually spin up alternatives that are available to people to make that information accessible.
Okay, we've got a question from Russ saying some clients don't necessarily see the value in seeing an optional cost to validate assumptions made. Does the same stand for accessibility? How do agencies make both testing and accessibility non-optional in web development builds?
Ripper question. Okay, so and I suppose there's a counter to that is, how does someone hiring an agency deal with that as well? Because one of the things we see quite often is the concept of having a contractual clause that says, this system you're going to build for us must be WCAG level A compliant, or whatever that clause is written in, and that automatically puts responsibility onto, say, the agency. So one part of it is obviously what's contractually in. It's obviously a challenge because it can end up being a cost for the agency has to wear. We like to talk about the importance of independence. It's fantastic that an agency will embark on building a particular platform for a client, but the fact that agency might drive, say, hey, we do want to bring in an independent third party for the benefit of all of us to make sure this is being done correctly. And that has a cost. Granted, I can understand the challenges in who has to wear that cost and where that sits. It probably depends very much on the palatability of the client. All that said, if we go back to some of the discussion around all of these different activities that can be done very early in the piece, very quick, rapid reviews, making sure we've planned ahead for using certain coding techniques before we get to the end, what that can mean is that the cost of addressing accessibility is phenomenally cheaper than applying an audit at the end and then having to do a whole stack of rework that has a considerable cost to it. It's probably my thoughts there. I hope that answers that. Okay,
look, a quick one here. Is there a possibility of automating the accessibility testing, particularly with Selenium?
Oh, you said a quick one there, Glenn. We need hours for this. Yeah, it's a really interesting space. We get asked this a lot. Test automation is a really key thing, and we know that possibly more than anyone in the functional testing space. Lots of thought, can I apply that to accessibility? To some extent, you could argue that that's the holy grail, to be able to automatically test and address accessibility all the time and with problem solved. There's been various tools that have come out in the market over the years to try and address that. Selenium being one of the platforms that does potentially let you address that through some of the not being a Selenium expert, but some of the libraries you can plug into Selenium to, for example, get Selenium to run an accessibility automated test practice. The challenge with accessibility is, broadly speaking, about half of the things you need to do for accessibility can be detected programmatically. The other half can't. Yeah. What that means is even if you are embarking on a automated accessibility approach, you can only get about halfway home anyway by the nature of the beast. Now, it's obviously better to get halfway home than nowhere home. So I sort of have the approach of, if you're going to apply some of those automated tools, that's better than doing nothing at all. But you do need to recognize that applying some automation for accessibility is not going to solve your risk around legal compliance or getting it fundamentally right. With that said, can you do it? Is it any good? It can be done to some extent, again, to 50%. what we've seen in some of the pilot projects we've done in that space is we find the automated tools tend to bring us so many false positives that it's actually not worth the effort. And that's a little bit like your classic return on investment for automation. You put in place automation to solve a whole lot of manual testing, only to spend more on constantly maintaining your automation suite. What we find in accessibility automation is, yes, you can run the test, but the amount of time you spend trawling through and trying to nut out these false positives, we can actually do the proper manual accessibility testing quicker than doing that anyway. So my summation of that is, even for us, we do hope accessibility automation will get better and become a reality in time. At this stage, it hasn't yet got to a point where it's really worth doing over and above manual testing.
This may have been, next one from Linda may have partially been addressed by you just now, but she's asked, are there recommended tools or plugins for project teams to help test native applications during design and or development to help detect accessibility issues earlier?
Tools, not specific tools from a development standpoint, by way of a piece of software. So one of the key things, particularly in native app development, is probably around training. I know that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but there are specific techniques that need to be applied in native app development, but is different to, say, a browser-based platform. So knowledge of those techniques up front is really, really key. But other than that, it's really about using the tools that are built into the devices, making sure your team knows how to turn the screen reader on in their iPhone and have a go. That kind of thing is really the way to apply that from a native app standpoint.
All right, I've got one more question here from Marty. It's simply, is there a certification for WCAG compliant websites?
WCAG certification is what's known as something that one self-certifies. So there's no official, governing body out there in the world who comes along and does a review of your website and puts a magic stamp on it that says, W3C officially certifies your website. It's what's called a self-certifying practice. So the principle is someone with a website can go and do their own testing or bring someone in like us to do the testing. And as a result of that, they then are able to say, we hereby declare through the work we've done that we certify our own website is WCAG compliant. That's where certification sits. It's actually one of the common misconceptions in the world. Actually, we need to get certified. Well, you sort of can get certified, but there's no official governing body to go and do that for you.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. We're running a little bit over time, so there's no more questions here at the moment. Again, you're always welcome to contact Greg and the team with any further questions you might have. I'd like to thank Greg for speaking today, and his contact details are up there on the screen. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees today for coming along as well. Any final words, Greg, from yourself?
Not at all. Just to reiterate, reach out any time with any questions. And again, really appreciate everyone attending today. Hopefully it was helpful.
Okay. Thank you all.